Well, happy Tuesday to everybody. We're still working on track plans. And today we're going to talk about basic turnouts because in order to figure out your track plan, you need to understand exactly how these turnouts work. So first, let's talk about some sort of basic terminology. People will refer to these as switches. Also, points, that's more of the British interpretation or European interpretation to refer to it as the points, and also turnout. I think turnout's the best expression to use because it best defines what this thing is. I got into a rather contentious discussion on the internet some years ago when I referred to the operator of a locomotive as the person driving the locomotive. And they said, well, technically you can't drive a train. A train is on tracks, and drive refers to steering something. Anyway, what actually steers a train is the turnout. Okay, let's look at the actual parts of the switch so that as we're discussing that, we're all on the same page. Let's go left to right. So over here, the head blocks, these are simply long ties, and whatever mechanism is going to throw the switch will be mounted to these extra long ties, a switch stand, a ground throw, a switch machine, whatever. But there's two ties here that are very long so that you can mount the mechanism that will throw the switch. Between the head blocks is a rod that connects the points together and actually throws the points from side to side. The switch rod, these come in a lot of different flavors. They're usually different on a model railroad than on a prototype railroad, but there's got to be some sort of rod that ties the 2 points together that will actually throw the switch. And then, of course, the points. Again, from a European perspective, they'll refer to the entire mechanism here, the entire track, as the points. But actually, these are the actual points. So I find it confusing to refer to the entire switch, the entire turnout, as points when there's this component within that is the actual points. At any rate, it's these two different rails that move right to left, which will cause the train to either divert down one path or the other by guiding the wheels. In this particular case, it's a very common situation with a switch where one of the tracks goes perfectly straight while the other one curves off in the divergent direction. And so the points themselves have a straight set of points, or a straight point and a curved points, because the points have to match the rail that they're opposing. So one of these two sets of points really needs to have a slight amount of curvature to it. Sometimes these are a separate forged or cast component. Sometimes on some railroads they would just grind these out of an actual piece of rail. For our model railroads, they're usually just made out of the rail that the rest of the railroad is made from, but in some cases we'll use a casting. I always use a casting here because it looks better. It looks more like the actual points on an actual railroad. On commercially available switches, Atlas, Caddo, whatever, these are usually made of stamped metal. They don't look that much like the actual points, but they're very nice, very functional. This is a switch that I'm working on right now. It was originally made by the guys over at Yagas Creek, and it was out on our railroad for quite some time. But you can see the different components here. The 2 points, the curved points, the straight points, the stock rails, the throw rod, and the head blocks, the long ties. In this case, there's a ground throw setting on those. It's going to go away, and I'm going to replace it with a switch stand. This is a left-hand switch, meaning that the rail on our right is the one that's curving away. The one on our left is the straight rail. Therefore, the points, the one on our left is the curved points, and the one on our right is the straight points. At the far end of the points is the heel of the points. There's a seam there because this is actually the pivot point around which the points will swivel when they throw left to right. So there has to be a hinged joint there at the heel of the points. The two rails which are on the outside of the turnout are the stock rails, and they're a continuous rail that just run all the way through the switch without any interruption. On a typical switch like this one, that means that there is a straight stock rail and a curved stock rail. On a curved switch, and it can be a curved switch that curves in both directions, a Y configuration, or where both stock rails turn in the same direction, creating a curved switch curving off to either the left or the right. On a prototype railroad, usually these are just a continuous rail without any modifications. They don't have to do anything to the stock rails at the points. The points are designed to fit neatly up inside the stock rails, so they don't have to modify the stock rails at all. Typically on our model railroad, we will notch the stock rails at the points so that the points have a little notch in there that they set into. Or we will bend the curved, we'll put a little kink in the curved stock rail so that the points can close up against that little kink. And we'll go over that when we talk about actually building a switch. In our switching yard, I decided that I wanted to try the more prototype technique of really filing the ends of the points so that they fit neatly up into the stock rail with no modifications to the stock rail at all. And that didn't work out super well, and it was a lot of work, and it's working fine. But from this point on, I'm going to use the technique of putting the little kink right there at the points in the curved rail. It really makes the process much simpler. I'll show you how this works in a video here in a week or two when I show the actual construction of the switch. Of course, if you're buying a commercially produced switch, Atlas, Cato, whatever, all of this work has been done for you. But it's fun to put your nose right down in there and see exactly what they've done. And occasionally you might need to change it. Just you've got some malfunction and you need to go in there and make an adjustment. As I mentioned, in the smaller scales and gauges, most often, pretty much always, there's going to be a little notch carved into the stock rail to accommodate the points so that they can close up into the stock rail and make a very smooth joint right there. Next up, we have the closure rails, and these are the two rails that connect to the points and run up to the frog. They're just short sections of just actual rail spiked in place. They don't move or anything. And next up, the frog, so named because somebody thought it looked like an upside down frog. At any rate, it's where the divergent rails cross over each other. And sometimes this is made out of rail on prototype railroads. Sometimes they would just cobble this together out of the rail. Sometimes when we're building our own switches, same thing. We'll just file the ends of the rail and bend the ends of the rail and solder this whole thing together to create the frog. On a commercially available switch, it's usually some sort of casting, plastic or metal casting, completely separate from the rails. Because it's where the left rail crosses over the right rail, in order to keep the whole railroad from shorting out when you're running power through your rails, the polarity of the frog either needs to change as the points change, or it needs to be an isolated frog, usually just made out of plastic, so that it's insulated so that it won't short out the railroad that way. But more often than not, I think it's much better if you have a powered frog, a metal frog that has power going to it, which means the polarity of the frog needs to switch from right to left as the points change. And now we have the guardrails. On either side of the frog is a rail up against the stock rail that creates a flangeway between the guardrail and the stock rail, which prevents the wheels from taking the wrong route as they go through the frog. It's called picking the frog, where a wheel takes the wrong route and the whole train derails. So in order to prevent that, there's a guardrail here that holds the wheel in place by pressing up against the back of the wheel. Most of the modern Class A railroads anymore use a frog which has extended wings on it that stick up higher than the rails to hold the back of the wheel in place that way, eliminating the need for the guardrail. So if you're doing a modern Class A railroad, you'd probably want to use something that doesn't have a guardrail. But I think most of the commercially available switches, I think all of the commercially available switches, utilize a guardrail. And when you're building your own switch, that's really the only way to go. Trying to duplicate the modern self-correcting frogs, it'd be a trick, but it could be done. Here's a graphic showing how the guardrail will prevent the wheel from picking the frog. You can see that as the wheel is going through the switch, the guardrail is up against the back of the wheel, up against the flange on the back of the wheel, preventing it from moving away from the stock rail, and therefore it can't pick the frog. Notice also that the flange on the wheel extends down into the flangeway, and on model railroads sometimes we have these enormously oversized flanges on some of our equipment. So if that's the case, we need to make sure that our flangeway can accommodate whatever flange we're going to send down through there. And so the compatibility between different types of equipment with different wheels is an issue here. Now, when it comes to planning out our railroad, the most important aspect of the turnout is the frog number, the angle of the actual frog. Therefore the angle of the switch. So the number refers to the proportion between the width of the separation versus the length. So if you take a measurement from the very point of the frog to some point beyond the frog, and then a measurement at that point between the two rails, the separation of the rails, and compare that as a proportion, that will be the number of the frog. So you can see here on our graph, the very first example, a number 4 switch, we have measured 4 units out from the point of the switch. That can be millimeters, meters, feet, inches, whatever. The key is we're going to set up a proportion of the distance between the two rails at that measurement, and that will become a proportion, in this case 4 to 1. There's 4 units of distance from the point to the point of measurement, and then 1 unit there between the two rails. A number 4 switch is really radical. We use those often in model railroading. You see them commonly used, especially in commercially available switches. But on a prototype railroad, you would rarely see a number 4 except possibly on a trolley system, like this beautiful number 4 switch we came across in Fort Collins. But it's a number 4 switch because the distance from the point here to some distance out on the rail here is exactly 4 times the distance between these two rails. Now, as I mentioned before, these switches can be curved, entirely curved. If they're curved in one direction, an inner curved switch, you simply have 2 different radiuses, an outer track radius and an inner track radius. In the case of outer curve switches, a Y configuration, the 2 tracks diverge away from each other, but both are curved. And a lot of these switches are available, of course, as pre-made components, so you can just buy them and lay them, or, I like constructing them myself, but if you want to simply buy one, here we have an outer curved switch, I believe, with a number 4 frog. It may be even a little sharper than a 4. It looks like it could even be like a 3. Usually we'll refer to this as a Y switch rather than an outer curve switch, but the idea is the same, outer curve switch or Y configuration switch. More often than not, though, a curved switch will be an inner curve switch like this, where we have 2 different radiuses, a very broad outer radius and a sharper inner radius. The trick here is finding the exact curved switch that you need for your track plan. What you really need to do is shop first for what's available and then design your track plan around that, because you're not likely to find exactly a 38-inch outer radius with a 20-inch inner radius or something. You just have to find a commercially available product and then design around it. And when we start getting into these unconventional switches, boy, all bets are off. There's so many different ways that you can configure these things. A crossover may also be a switch, a single crossing switch, double slip switch, single slip switch, where the crossing actually functions as a switch. Three-way switches that are sometimes curved three-way switches. And especially if you're going to design and build your own switches, boy, the sky's the limit here. It can be a lot of fun figuring out exactly how you want to go about configuring your switch. So for the next couple of weeks, we're going to delve back into this subject of scratch building your own switches, simply because that's what I'm doing right now on the railroad. And I hope you want to follow along with that. So if you're not a subscriber to the channel, please subscribe. And if you liked this video, please hit the like button. And the easy, simple, painless way to subscribe is to hit the upcoming blue button. Zoink, right there, the blue button. We're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And Karen and I will see you here on Sunday, because we have something fun to show you. See you then. Bye-bye.